Hi, my name is Carla Ahern and I work at the Kootenay-Columbia Discovery Center Society at the Creston Valley Wildlife Management Area, and we offer wetland education and awareness programming. We're super excited to be part of the Creston Valley Bird Festival. The 9th annual went virtual this year, so we're excited to be able to offer a program called Birds 101 for the festival. That's for kids and families, and we're going to present you a program that's going to be really fun and informative and have some follow-up resources and activities for you as well. So right now I am standing with the wetland behind me at the Creston Valley Wildlife Management Area, and I wanted to quickly touch on some background. So the Creston Valley Wildlife Management Area is a 17,000 acre wetland habitat. It stretches from the southern end of Kootenay Lake all the way down to the US border. And it is a managed wetland. So it was set aside in 1968, and it has a series of dikes and culverts that were put in place so that the water levels could be managed and maintained year-round for to provide habitat for the variety of different wildlife species that live here. So we're really lucky to have such a huge expanse of wetland that's protected and set aside. And behind me we can see right now there are some ducks and swans on the pond, which is pretty cool. So in the springtime, our wetlands here in the Creston Valley are located along the Pacific Flyway. So that means it is a location when the birds are migrating north and south. It's a spot where they can stop and rest and feed on their long journey. So in the springtime, usually starting in March, you start to get all the different waterfowl, so ducks, geese, swans, that are stopping off in the ponds, feeding, resting, recharging themselves as they continue on their journey. So sometimes at Duck Lake, for example, you'll see tens of thousands of waterfowl all tucked tightly together on the lake, resting and feeding, and making sure that they're ready to continue on their journey. We also get quite a lot of these species that do stay over the summer months. So they will actually find their partner and breed and raise their young here in the wetlands. So a lot of the ducks, geese. We also get a variety of songbirds, hawks, owls, you name it. We've got about 300 different bird species that call the Creston Valley home. Some of those species are a little more rare occurrences, but many of them are ones that we find in migration. We find them year-round, and we have a huge diversity of birds. And not only birds, we have mammals, 57 mammals, 17 fish, 6 reptiles, 6 amphibians, and a wide variety of plant life here, as well as obviously invertebrate species too as well. But obviously for our purposes for this presentation, we're going to be touching more on birds. We're going to chat a little bit more about bird biology. So we're going to look at what makes birds unique and different from other wildlife species. And we're also going to look at some of their different adaptations that they have for life in our wetlands here. And then we're going to also look at some of their different senses that they use in their environment to figure out what's going on around them. We're sitting inside the Discovery Center. So behind me you can see some of our displays and some of the taxidermy birds that we have in the center to take a look at. What we're going to talk about right now is what makes birds unique and different from other wildlife species. And first I wanted to talk about what kind of characteristics birds share in common with other wildlife. So some of those observations we could make are that birds fly. So they do, and who else flies? Well, we have insects, bats. Those are some that fly. You can probably think of some examples too. What else? Birds can swim, which they can. A lot of duck species can either dabble on the surface or dive underneath, for example. And we've seen ospreys and eagles kind of dive underneath the water to get to their prey. What else can swim? Well, we have fish can swim, turtles, otters. Again, a lot of different other birds that are not birds, a lot of different other wildlife that can also swim as well. What else? Beaks. Birds have beaks. What other animals have beaks? Well, platypus has a beak. Turtles, they have beaks too as well. And what else? What's another characteristic we can think of that birds share with other animals? They have webbed feet. Yes, birds have webbed feet. Some do. Those that like to swim, like our ducks, for example, would have webbed feet. Who else has webbed feet? Well, beavers and otters can have webbed feet for swimming in the water too as well. And again, I'm sure you can think of a lot of other examples of animals that have webbed feet too as well. So birds share a lot of different characteristics with other wildlife species. But what I want to talk to you about is 3 things that make a bird unique and different from other wildlife. Okay? So our first one we're going to talk about a little bit is feathers. So feathers are unique to birds. I'm just going to grab my great horned owl here as a reference. So here's our great horned owl. So feathers are usually located throughout a bird's body. And there's actually 3 different kinds of feathers that birds have. The first kind are called flight feathers. So flight feathers are usually located on the wing and on the tail too as well. So birds use their tail a lot of the time for steering themselves when they're flying. And then their wing feathers are full of flight feathers. And flight feathers are usually have a thicker shaft on them and they're quite strong and stiff. So obviously that's going to help them when they're trying to fly, right? So we have flight feathers, and then we have the second kind of feathers, which are called contour feathers. So contour feathers are usually colorful and patterned feathers that make a bird unique and different from other bird species. So if we're looking at our great horned owl here, his pattern is browns, whites, grays, different stripes and mottled patterns on the feathers. So that's going to make this great horned owl unique and different from other bird species. We also, for example, can look at the red-winged blackbird. So that bird is all black, except on its wing, it has a bar of red and yellow feathers. So those are that bird's contour feathers. And what's interesting about a blackbird is that usually the brighter that those red feathers are, it means the more dominant male, which is kind of interesting. So it's kind of like a guy who wears a nice bright Hawaiian shirt. He's kind of, loud and proud saying, look at my beautiful colors. Our red-winged blackbird's kind of doing the same thing. So that's flight feathers, contour feathers, and then our last type of feathers are our insulation feathers, are also known as our underwear feathers. So these feathers are ones that are going to be really close to the bird's body. They're usually really fluffy and they trap air in that fluff, and then the bird can heat up that air close to the skin and keep it nice and warm. So this might be your one and only time that you get to look at an owl bum. And I'm going to kind of put up the tail feathers a little bit so that you can kind of see those feathers inside. Those are going to be the fluffy insulation feathers, and if I touch them, they're extremely soft, really soft. So again, that's going to trap air inside those soft feathers, and it's going to allow that bird to insulate itself and keep itself nice and warm. So those are our 3 different types of feathers that we find on a bird. So let's say them again. We have our flight feathers, our contour feathers, and our insulation feathers. It's going to pop this guy down. Okay, so we talked about 3 different things that make a bird unique and different from other wildlife species. So we did feathers, and the next one we're going to talk about is this. What are these? Well, as we can see, we have tubes that I'm holding, and does anybody have any idea what these might represent when it comes to a bird? So think about that for a sec. What could these represent when we're talking about a bird? What this represents is hollow bones. So birds, in order to fly, need to actually be quite light. So they've developed hollow or fused bones that allow a bird to be very light so that it can easily pop up in the air. If we think about our bones, they're extremely dense and heavy, right? Filled with marrow, and they're not so light. If we plastered feathers all over our body, do you think that we would easily be able to pop up in the air and take flight? Probably not. We're way too heavy. So a bird has developed hollow bones so that it's easier for them to fly. So if we take a look at a hummingbird, for example, so hummingbird, although a small bird, is extremely light. It only weighs about as much as a dime. So if you put a dime in your hand, you can almost barely feel that in your hand. And that is about how much a hummingbird weighs. Okay, so hollow bones are another thing that makes a bird unique and different from other species. And then our third thing is represented by this. This is huge, right? This doesn't come from a native bird in our Creston Valley. It comes from an ostrich. So this is an ostrich egg. So having an egg, does that make it unique to a bird? Well, let's think about that. Other animals have eggs and lay eggs, don't they? We have fish that lay eggs, turtles, snakes. So other animals do lay eggs, but there's something about a bird's egg that's unique and different. So if you look at a fish egg, they're quite slimy on the outside. They're protected by a coating of kind of mucus. And then we have reptile eggs, so an example of a turtle or a snake. And those ones on their shell is actually hard and rubbery. So what would make a bird's egg unique and different from other eggs? You hear me tap on that? The kind of shell that a bird has is a hard shell. Okay, so they lay hard-shelled eggs. They're calcium on the outside, which makes them quite hard. So that makes a bird unique and different, is having hard-shelled eggs. The neat thing about an egg too as well is that not many or any bird eggs are usually full circles. They're usually an oval shape. Do you have any idea why an oval shape might be a good shape for an egg to be for a bird, if you think about it? Well, if an egg is in a nest and it happens to roll or move, if it's an oval shape, it'll just roll in a circle right back to itself. So it has less of a chance of falling out of the nest. If you had a circle egg, like the shape of a golf ball or a ping pong ball, and that started to move, it could easily just fly right and roll right off the nest. So having an oval shaped egg is also very helpful when you're a bird having an egg in a nest. So that's the three things that make a bird unique and different from other wildlife species. They have feathers, they have hollow bones, and they have hard-shelled eggs. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about feathers because I think the science behind a feather is pretty cool. So feathers, as we kind of talked about, are what makes a bird able to fly and to keep itself warm. The neat thing about feathers is they are actually made of keratin, which is the same thing that your fingernails and hair are made of. And feathers grow out of follicles, just like our hair grows out of follicles on our head. So different birds have different number of feathers. So a small songbird can have about 3,500 feathers to maybe 5,000 feathers on its body. And then you could look at a duck or a water bird that can have about 25,000 feathers on their body. So it's a big range in the amount of feathers that they can have. And if we're to look at the structure of a feather, it's kind of neat how it actually works, how a feather is actually put together. I'm just going to quickly draw it for you on the board here. So our feathers have on the inside of it what's called a shaft. Okay, so that's kind of the core part of the feather. So it's hollow and the thickness of it varies. So a wing feather is going to have a very thick shaft. It's making it very stiff and strong. And one of the smaller contour feathers or insulation feathers are going to have a thinner shaft on it. So here's our feather here, for example, that kind of goes around the shaft. So from the shaft, you actually have these fine little hairs, not really hairs, I guess, pieces of the feather coming off the shaft. And those are called barbs. Okay, so there's barbs coming off of the shaft. And off of each barb are these other little pieces going the other way, hooking the two barbs kind of together almost. Like that, and those are called the barbicels. Okay, and the last part, and the really cool part about the feather, is that on the end of each of those barbicels is a little hook. Okay, and that little hook will keep all those barbs and barbicels together, like that. Pretty cool, hey? If you have a magnifying glass, if you ever find a feather and you have a magnifying glass at home, if you actually look really closely at the structure of the feather, you can see those fine lines coming off the shaft. You can see those barbs coming off the shaft. And if you try to actually, if you have a feather, you can find a feather at home, or if you're out for a walk, or if you can't find a feather, please stop into the Discovery Center when we're open. We have lots to look at, and you can take an up close and look at a feather. So if we look at a bird feather like this one, so this one, a bird has lost its feather, and you can see that it kind of looks quite damaged, right? It's got a lot of kind of holes, rips in the feather. Okay, so that is those little hooks are no longer working very well. They're not keeping the feather together. So when a feather kind of gets to this point where there's lots of holes in it, a bird will actually what's called molt the feather. They will actually lose that feather and regrow a new one. It usually happens about 2 times a year that birds will lose their feathers and regrow them. The larger the feather it is, the longer it takes to grow. So a lot of our waterfowl will molt in the summertime just before fall migration comes. They want to have kind of a new set of flight feathers, make sure they're all in really good condition. And they'll lose a lot of their flight feathers and actually be flightless for a few weeks. So in the hot summer months of August, you tend to not see that many waterfowl moving around, and a lot of the times it's because they've lost all their flight feathers and they can't fly and they're hiding out. They don't want to be seen. They want to be hiding in the cattails and in the grasses. So because they can't escape a predator, they can't fly away. So molting the feathers is one way. Once a feather becomes quite worn like this, is one way to kind of get rid of the feather and grow a new one. But before a bird molts its feather, what it will try to do is repair it. Okay, so here's a feather that's in pretty good shape. It does kind of have a big chunk that's taken out up here, but otherwise it actually looks pretty good. So if for some reason a feather happens to have a little bit of a rip in it like that, we'll just kind of make a rip here. So what's happened is when a rip happens like that, these little hooks on the barbs and the barbicels are not hooked into its neighbor anymore. It's not able to grab on and to make a solid feather. Okay, but it doesn't mean that this feather is not useful anymore. What a bird can do is actually fix their feather. It's called preening. And you might have seen a bird use its beak and kind of run its beak through its feathers. And usually what it's doing, it can be cleaning itself. It can be distributing, if it's a waterfowl, it can be distributing oil on its feathers to make itself waterproof. But a lot of the times what it's doing is actually fixing or zipping their feathers back together. So it's kind of like a zipper or like Velcro, where you're trying to get those hooks to get back together. And you can try this at home too as well. Again, if you have a feather that you can use, you can kind of make a little bit of a rip. And you grab your thumb and your index finger, kind of like you're being a beak. And what you do is you run those 2 fingers through the feather, one on each side, and gently stroke that feather. And what I've actually done is I have zipped that feather back together. I have fixed it. So a bird will preen a lot. It'll fix its feathers to make sure that they're in good working condition. But if they do get to a point where they're too broken, too many holes, and they can't be zipped back together again, then the bird will molt or lose that feather and grow a new one. So kind of cool, I think. Feathers kind of are a neat makeup. When you just kind of look at a feather like that, you don't think it might have all those parts to it, but it's actually quite a little network of neat inventions that keep that feather zipped together and able to help that bird to fly and stay warm. We're going to talk a little bit about adaptations. So some of the different ways that birds will adapt to their environment in order to survive. So if you think about it, the main goal of all wildlife, really, birds included, is to make sure that you get enough food to survive. If we look at birds, they've developed a variety of different adaptations to ensure that they can get food. They're adapted for a variety of different ecosystem types, from deserts to wetlands, as well as a variety of different food sources. Some examples of adaptations in birds are eyes. If we look at birds of prey or hawks, for example, they have binocular vision. So their eyes see like they're looking through a pair of binoculars. So they can see very far away, up to 3 kilometers. So if they're flying high up in the air and looking down, they're going to be able to see a really large distance in order to find the prey that they're looking for on the ground. If we look at things like wings, swallows, for example, are aerial insectivores, and they have adapted to hunting insects on the wing by developing a slender, streamlined body and long, pointed wings, which allow for great maneuverability and endurance, as well as frequent periods of gliding. So they have the ability to move up, down, left, right in pursuit of their insect prey. If we look at feet, for example, we have webbed or lobed feet for ducks, waterfowl, and coots and grebes. These types of feet are going to help these birds swim in the water and navigate around on mud, grass, and even ice. And lastly, beaks. We're going to talk a little bit more about how The shape of a beak is going to determine the type of food that a bird can eat. The shape of a beak and its function and form will determine what that animal is able to eat. And I have a lot of different examples here in front of me of different shaped beaks. And how I'm going to represent different shaped beaks is actually by looking at different tools. So different tools, human tools that we use are going to kind of symbolize how a beak on a certain bird might work. So for example, if I were to look at this, so what is that? It's like a big rake tool, right? You put that in soil to try and loosen and move things around. So if I had a beak that was kind of like this, what kind of beak would that be and what would it be trying to eat? So what this could represent is a beak from a bird of prey, which is like a beak that will tear at things. So basically a bird of prey's beak is there to tear at flesh of things, whether it's a fish they're trying to eat, a small mammal, another bird. They use that beak to rip and tear the flesh and then swallow it. So birds actually don't have teeth, so they're not able to chew their food. They kind of just swallow it whole. So we're going to look at how their digestive system handles that in a little bit. But first of all, we're going to keep on discussing the beak form, and this one would be representing a beak of a bird of prey that would be tearing away at flesh. And a lot of time those bird of prey beaks are very curved in shape, so that they kind of are like a hook, and that way they can tear away at the flesh of whatever they're trying to eat. If I were to look at this, what is that one? A nutcracker, right? So we have a lot of small songbirds who have very short, strong beaks that act like a nutcracker because they are out searching for nuts and seeds to eat, things that they have to crack open a hard shell with. So their beak acts like a nutcracker. Again, it's very short, usually thick, and is able to crack nuts open. An example could be a grosbeak. They have a quite dense beak that's very strong, that they're able to crack open different things to eat, which is kind of cool. We have a little ones there too. There's some examples. We have an evening grosbeak and we have a sparrow. So they're able to crack nuts and seeds open with a beak that is short and strong, just like a nutcracker. All right, let's look at another one. This one's kind of cool. What's that? It's like a strainer, right? What kind of bird would have a beak like a strainer? We think about some of our different duck species, or even pelicans. So what those guys are doing is they're taking scoops of water in their beak. And they don't necessarily want all that water, they want what's in the water. So they want the small insects, they want the plant life, they want to eat those things that are in the water. So they take that scoop of water, and then what they do is they squirt the water out of their mouth, and it acts like a big sieve, and keeps all the small insects and plants inside their mouth, and water squirts out the side. The neat thing about a duck is their beak is kind of like a comb. So when they take that big swallow of water, along the edge of their beak are little kind of comb-like pieces that are up and down. And what they can do is squirt the water out the comb, and what the comb does is keep all those small insects inside and plant life inside, so that they can swallow that down and not have to eat all that water. So that's kind of a neat one there, and here's a picture to represent that. There's the strainer beak, and you can see actually the duck beak there shows those fine little combs on the side that help to keep the insects and bugs inside and the water out. Let's see about another one here we have. Look at this one. This one's like a skewer. It's very sharp at the tip. So let's think about how that beak might work. That maybe might be more like a stab, right? Could that be like a stabbing beak, right? Maybe, for example, a great blue heron would have a beak that would stab, right? So they might be stalking a fish. They'll be standing at the edge of the water looking. And the thing about a great blue heron is they will stand for hours in one spot, waiting for something to come to them, as opposed to expending a lot of energy trying to find a fish or a frog to eat. They stand at the water's edge and wait for a fish to swim by. And once they see that fish, they use their beak more like a spear. They stab the fish with it. Okay, so there's an example of a stabbing beak from our great blue heron. Okay, so he's going to stab the fish with it, and then he'll open his mouth and swallow that whole. It's a very long, sharp beak. Good, and let's look at one more. A straw. Who would have a beak like a straw? Think about our hummingbirds. So what hummingbirds eat is nectar. So they actually need to suck up nectar from flowers. So they actually have a long tongue that comes out and helps them to suck the nectar up from flowers. So they have a beak like a straw. And there's an example of some of our hummingbirds. You can see right here where their long tongue is coming out of their beak and helping them to suck up and sip nectar from flowers. Pretty neat. And a quick few other one. I have one more. Would be more like a tweezer or tongue beak. So we're looking at birds that have a little bit of a longer beak, that they're able to actually use it to, some of them put it in the mud, dig out a worm or a small insect from the mud, just like a pair of tweezers would. So that could be some of our shorebirds might use their tongue, or sorry, their beak like that, or even a robin, for example, could have more of a tweezer beak, where they can get worms and insects, pinch them off the ground. So depending on the shape of a bird's beak will depend on the type of food that they are able to eat. So once a bird has actually ingested its food, it now needs to try to break that down. And birds are kind of unique because, like we said, they don't have teeth. They have evolved over time to be as light as possible, which means having hollow bones and no teeth. So they don't have the ability to chew things to help get the digestion started. So what birds have is something called a gizzard. So the gizzard is like a strong muscular structure that helps to break the food down. So a lot of songbirds that eat seeds will also actually ingest small stones as well that stay in the gizzard and help, those stones help to kind of break down those seeds that that bird is eating. Gizzards can be extremely strong. If you look at a wild turkey's gizzard, for example, their gizzard can pulverize things like walnuts and acorns, which if you think about it, you need something quite strong to be able to break those open and break them down. So turkeys have an extremely strong gizzard. If we look at our birds of prey, a lot of the time with their tearing beak, they will try to tear away and eat just the flesh. They don't really want to try and eat the bones and the teeth of things that aren't really that digestible. They will try to not ingest and just therefore use their beaks to tear away at the flesh to eat. But the gizzard's pretty amazing. So it helps to break down all that food source for the birds. Like I said, some birds will swallow stones to help with that digestion. Owls are a little bit different. So they will actually usually swallow their prey whole. Okay, so they've taken this whole mouse in or small bird, and their gizzard is, trying to digest it. And it does the best job that it can, but it's usually left with non-digestible parts, such as teeth, bones, fur, and feathers, things that the bird cannot break down and digest. So what happens with those things? Well, what an owl does, it creates a pellet out of them. It takes about 6 to 10 hours to create a pellet, and that pellet will consist of all of the non-digestible things inside of the gizzard. So after the 6 to 10 hour period, the pellet has been created in the stomach, and then the bird will bring it back up. It'll actually throw up that pellet. And I have an example of what an owl pellet looks like. So right there, the top one is a whole pellet, and then the middle two are ones that they've opened up. The middle one is a mammal. So it's a mammal prey that the owl has eaten. So inside that would be teeth, bones, and fur, things that the owl could not digest. And on the bottom, we have an avian prey. So that's a small bird that the owl has eaten. So there'll be feathers and bones, beaks, things that the owl could not digest. So that is what is inside those owl pellets. So if you see an owl pellet at the base of a tree, that might be the tree that the owl has perched at. You know, it's maybe rested for those hours that it takes to create the pellet and then sat on that tree and then brought that pellet up. So look up into the tree, and you never know, you might see an owl sitting up there having had digested its meal and taking care to expel those bits that it can't digest. We're going to talk to you a little bit about birds and how they use some of their senses. So we do know that there are 5 senses out there: hearing, sight, touch, taste, and smell. When it comes to the bird world, usually they rely most on their sense of hearing and their sense of sight. Those are kind of the 2 key senses that birds rely on to understand what's going on around them in their environment. And we have our great horned owl here again, and we're going to talk a little bit about his sense of sight and hearing. So first, if we talk about the sense of sight, our owl here has these big eyes. And like his eyes are very similar to human eyes in that they have both rods and cones in their eyes. Now cones, a type of photoreceptor, help us to see color and shades of gray in lots of detail. And the rods help us see more at nighttime and in dim or low light. So when I have a nocturnal animal like our owl here, and nocturnal means that they're out at nighttime, do you think it's going to have more rods or more cones in its eyes? Definitely more rods, because what this owl wants to do is bring as much light into his eyes as possible so that he can see well at nighttime. So our owl has lots of rods in his eyes. And what's interesting about an owl's eyesight is that they can see really well at nighttime, okay, because of all those rods. If I were to light a candle about 1,000 meters or a kilometer away from myself, the owl will be able to see that lit candle, a pathway of light to that lit candle from a kilometer away. Do you think that we would be able to see a lit candle from a kilometer away at nighttime? No, not very easily at all. We as humans have way more cones in our eyes than we do rods. So we can see well with detail during the day, but we do have a little more difficulty at night seeing quite as clearly as an owl would. The neat thing about an owl's eyes is that they are fixed in their head. Okay, so if we keep our head pointed straight, we can look to our right by moving our eyes, and we can look to our left by just moving our eyes and keeping our head straight. Give it a try. Look to the right, keep your head nice and still, and look to the left. Pretty easy for us to do. An owl can't do that. His eyes are constantly looking straight forward. So if the owl wants to see to the right, he has to turn his head, keeping his eyes fixed in one spot, all the way to the right to look. And the same with the left. So give that a try too as well. Keep your eyes fixed straight, and then don't move your eyes, but move your head to the right so that you can see. Now an owl can't quite move its head a full 360 degrees around in a circle, but it's pretty close. It can do about 280 degrees. So although they can't see directly behind them, they can turn their head enough to one side that they can pretty well have a good idea of what's going on behind them, which is pretty cool. I have an owl skull right here. So here is the skull of a great horned owl, which looks quite tiny really. When we think about it, this is actually underneath the great horned owl, but it's covered with a lot of feathers, making it seem a lot bigger. But what's really neat about this is looking at the eye socket, and you can see it's quite a large socket, and you can see that it is actually just focused in straight in one direction. Right? And that's where those eyes have to stay fixed. And if he wants to see, he's got to turn that neck and turn that head all the way from one side to the other in order to see. So pretty cool. All right, so that's how our owl will see at nighttime. And what about hearing? Do you think an owl has a good sense of hearing? Yeah, it actually does. Our owl has 2 ears, one on either side, and they're kind of located near these tufts. Do you think that those tufts help the owl to hear? A little bit of a trick question. Scientists figure that actually no, the tufts don't help the owl to hear, that they're more decorative. So they actually think that those tufts will make an owl blend into a tree by looking like a little branch sticking out so that they can camouflage themselves quite well in a tree. And it also kind of makes them look a little bit evil or mean, which can be helpful, I guess, if you're an owl and you're trying to scare off something that might try to eat you or something that's scary itself. If you look scary, then maybe it'll not want to come and have a look. So you think that that makes the owl look a little bit mean and scary? I don't know, maybe a little. But as far as scientists have extrapolated, they don't think those tufts actually help the owl to hear. But he does have 2 ear holes on either side of his head. And kind of the neat thing about those ears is that they're not located at the exact same height on their head like our ears are. If we look at our ears and touch them on either side, they're pretty well equal height on each side. An owl has 1 ear that's up high and 1 ear that's down low. Interesting, hey? How do you think that might make an owl hear better? Well, if the owl's perched up in the tree canopy and it's listening at nighttime, trying to hear rustling in the leaves or trying to hear a scurrying of a creature on the forest floor, having ears that are at 2 different heights are actually going to let that owl be able to tell where from ground to treetop that sound is coming from. By having those ears at 2 different heights, they have a way better depth perception on where those sounds are coming from in terms of from the floor, forest floor, all the way up to the top of the tree canopy. So having ears at different height can actually help them to hear quite a bit better. Pretty neat. So our owl uses its sense of hearing and its sense of sight to be able to understand what's going on around it